Education. We like to think of it as a right, but it's one which millions of children all over the world simply go without. Today, 39 million children in war zones don't go to school. What becomes of them, and who's ensuring that they have even a shot at a basic education? Direct from the World Innovation Summit for Education in Doha, Qatar, this is Inside Story. Hello everyone and welcome to this special edition of Inside Story. We are out and about in the Qatari capital Doha at the WISE conference, that is the World Innovation Summit for Education, the second such summit we've had in 2 years here in Doha, designed to bring together academics, people from the public and private sector, business people, all people though who've got a stake in education, in access to education, in improving access to education and doing so through innovation. For today's Inside Story, we have assembled a panel of delegates to discuss education, but really the issue of education in war zones. And I will introduce our panel in a moment. Before we do that, I do want to just bring up the map and talk about a few of the countries where perhaps this problem is most acute. Places like Afghanistan, 2 million children out of the education system. Of course, 9 years of conflict there following the 9/11 attacks and the subsequent invasion. You look at Pakistan as well, 7 million. Sudan, 3 million. This is children out of the education system. Internal battles is what really marks those two countries. And then even places like Gaza and the West Bank, where it may not be an acute conflict right now, but years of occupation have obviously had a huge impact on the way people are educated and the systems which are in place. So as I say, we have our panel in place here. I'd like to introduce them all to you. We have Tova Vang, who is from the Save the Children organisation, from a particular part of the organisation called Rewrite the Future. We've got Khalil Hindi, who is the president of Birzeit University in the West Bank. And rounding out our panel is Mushtaq Chopra. He is from the Citizens Foundation of Pakistan, which works with children at primary and secondary age in Pakistan. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to have you on the show, really is. Tova Vang, let's start with you first of all. When conflict breaks out, when war breaks out, am I oversimplifying to say that education is one of the first things which goes by the wayside? It's not seen as an acute problem, it gets forgotten almost immediately.
I think you're right. One used to think that when you have an ongoing conflict, you can sort of wait until it gets peaceful and then provide education. But we all know that conflicts these days, they last for 5, 10, 15, maybe 30 years. And you will lose out maybe 5, 6 generations of primary school children if you do not provide education during conflict.
Is the intent there? Do people think about it, or do they not even put thought to it at the time?
I think they seem to think it's too difficult and too risky, and they might be right in certain situations. And also you see that donor communities are not so keen to support education in conflict situations. So, but as I've said, we have no choice. These children have exactly the same right to education as children living in Doha or in Oslo, for that matter.
Mushtaq, let me bring you in here. How do you think education can be maintained in a war zone? Tell me about Pakistan as well, because you're there, as I described it before, it's certainly over the last year or so, 18 months, it's been a battle within. It's a country almost at war with itself. How do you even think about maintaining education? The sheer logistics of it must be impossible when you've got displaced people for a start.
Yes, the problem, like Tove said, is compounded because for let's say Citizen Foundation run schools which have a all-female faculty, and it's impossible to get the girls, in a war zone. You can't possibly transport the girls. It's not even safe and not secure. The best possible situation, if it's a prolonged conflict, would be to have makeshift, as we call the tent schools. We have had this situation in Pakistan during the earthquake and during the recent floods. Technically, they were not a warlike situation. However, there was a
pretty close to
very close to that, and where the population was displaced. So what we did was that in order that, because you see, education is something which has to be continuous and on a regular basis. Otherwise, the child, millions of children would not they'd lose that year. So you have to have either in separate premises, makeshift premises, in tents, whatever best you could come up with, and obviously in safe zones or safe areas, and get them to go through the basic education to the best of our ability.
We're going to come back to Pakistan in some more depth later. I'd just like to bring Khalil into the conversation now. You come from a slightly different perspective. As I outlined earlier, the occupied Palestinian territory is not an ongoing war zone. There are spot conflicts, obviously, but it must have a huge impact on the way you can educate, the level that you can take things to there, being under occupation for so long.
Absolutely. Palestinians, through bitter experience, have learned that their only hope for the future and the only way that they can realize their aspirations is through education. And so even though the situation is horrendous and has been horrendous for about 40 years, and the conflict may not be a raging war, but it is an acute conflict nevertheless. However, Palestinians have persevered, and the level of education in the country is quite high. The rates of enrollment are quite high. Nevertheless, the dearth of resources, the pressure, the psychological pressure that the whole population, particularly young people, are under, have had their toll on education. My own area of expertise is higher education, and I can tell you in greater detail, if you wish, later on or maybe now, about the effect of the conflict on higher education.
This is exactly what I was going to ask you. This was my follow-up question. I'd like to get into the mindset of the students that come through Birzeit University in the West Bank, because I suspect some of them, most of them, they just want an education. They just want to be able to study and go out and find a job. But they are under siege in many, I think in their mind they're probably under siege, and they must be wondering also, well, when I get my degree, where am I going? Where's the job for me?
Well, I mean, universities in the West Bank, including my own university, have a great deal of problems. And these stem, again, from the occupation and the oppression under which the Palestinian people have been living. Universities in general have a civilizing role, but this role becomes all the more challenging and all the more difficult in the barbaric situations of acute conflict and oppression. One problem that we have is that students come to us with psychological problems that have been caused by the oppression and by the occupation. They also come to us with little respect for authority. And in fact, you could say that the structures of authority in the Palestinian society under occupation have been impaired when students or young children see their teachers being dragged out of their classroom by the Israeli army and slapped on the face, and their parents imprisoned and kicked in front of their children, sometimes mortally injured in front of their children. All this leads to impairment of the structures of authority. So they come to university with this handicap, and university education will have to cope with this, overcome it, and then start playing the civilizing role that universities normally play.
You make an excellent point about the psychological effects. Tovan, let me ask you, what have you seen on the ground? You've been to places, you were telling me, like Nepal, Sri Lanka, which 25 years it saw an extraordinary conflict that's only just come to an end, really. Tell me about the psychological effects you've seen there on children.
I think our experience really points to the fact that when young children can go to school during conflict, you provide a place of normalcy for children. And it's really vital that they have these hours during the day when they can be children and learn. So, but we also see, as was explained here, that they have psychological traumas when coming to school. So it's important that teachers in conflict areas are aware of this and actually can meet the children on their premises.
Well, because Mushtaq was saying to us earlier that it needs to be sustained. There's no point, I mean, you can try and set up some sort of education system in a conflict zone, but it has to be sustained for it to have any effect, and for the children to realize that they need this as well.
And one of the key learnings we have had from Rewrite the Future, which has been about providing education in conflict areas for the last 5 years, is that if you really anchor it in the community and make the schools community owned and close to home, as was the example from Pakistan, then you're more likely to continue the education throughout conflict.
So the idea that it's community-based, it's not set up by any given force, government or military, which someone could end up resenting.
That's very true. I mean, if the community has built the school, it might not be very fancy, but it's functioning. It's more likely to be protected and maintained if it's owned and built by the community than if it's, for instance, built by the armed forces, because people then get mixed up on who owns the school and what is it for and what's the purpose of the school. So local community engagement, both in school and also providing safe walking to school, is very, very important.
Very interesting. Let's bring Mushtaq back in. Obviously, your specialty area is Pakistan. I think there's a lot of interesting elements to education in Pakistan. I'm reading here from a Brookings Institute report back in June, which was addressing the issue of the madrasas and saying, look, these aren't where the real problems come from, as I think sometimes the Western view is, oh, the madrasas is where the extremists come from and children aren't getting the right education. It was actually saying that there is a very poor public education system in Pakistan, and it's got issues of corruption, teachers who don't turn up and get paid regardless, or government jobs for government people and all sorts of things. Is anyone looking at that and addressing that?
Well, first of all, the audience has to understand what exactly is the problem with the madrasa system. In countries like, Pakistan, I assume there are more than about 28,000 or 30,000 madrasas. You have to realize that with the poverty levels, where the half the population is living under $2 a day, and there is no stoppage of children. There's the population is rising at 3% per annum, and there are so many children, so they are not able to feed those children. So these madrasas, in a way, are sort of parking places for their children. You see, the madrasas are providing food and clothing and shelter.
So they're not the first option necessarily, but because of the social
pressures. The social pressures, or literally the parents or the population is abdicating their responsibilities, so to say, and parking or putting their children so that their responsibility to feed them, it's temporarily sort of shifted from them to the madrasas.
And if you add conflict on top of that, as we've seen in Pakistan, the one I remember clearly is the Swat Valley, because that time the government went in and they were going after Al-Qaeda, going after the Taliban, but it created more of a problem with the displaced people. It was a battle within, it was the government fighting inside its own country. And the effect on children who then suddenly lose their school, can't go to school, lose their stream of education, it must be a huge effect on them.
Totally. This is the trauma I speak about. You see, it's not only the trauma which comes from the war zones or the war-like situation. In my part of the world, every child is target of a trauma, because the parents are not home, and these children are aimlessly roaming around in the slums and the villages of Pakistan, because either they are from broken homes, or they are from homes where the mother and father both are working, and they leave the homes very early in the morning. So the children are basically without any guardian, without any guidance. And what do you expect out of them? Unless and until they are, these are like any other children anywhere else. They have to be nurtured. They have to be brought and guided into, like plants, like saplings. So they need that care and that share wherever they go. So I feel that's a trauma in itself, and which TCF partly is addressing this problem.
Okay, Khalil, I know your specialty is higher education. However, I think what Mushtaq said still has an effect. If you have, as you do in the occupied territories, children growing up under this sort of siege mentality, it's going to affect them from very young, and it's going to mean their chances of getting to Birzeit University, getting to higher education, which I'm reading here offers a fantastic amount of postgraduate degrees and undergraduate degrees. It's a fantastic facility. Their chances of getting there are so small in the first place.
Well, if you compare the West Bank and Gaza, for that matter, to other societies with similar levels of income and similar levels of living standard. The enrollment rate at universities in the Palestinian territories is quite high and quite respectable. And that is born out of the respect that Palestinians have developed for education and for seeking knowledge. The problem is that the children living under these conditions, growing under these conditions, do, as we said earlier on, have psychological problems, have a great deal of pressure on them. This leads to a great deal of internalized, what I call internalized violence within the society, particularly within youth. And this internalized violence erupts in many ways, in schools and universities and so on. Nevertheless, observers have observed that given the acute conditions of conflict that Palestinians live under, and the prolonged period over which they have lived under these conditions, compared with that, the Palestinian society is a very civilized society nevertheless. And people, external observers, admire the resilience of the people, they admire their zest for life, they admire their aspirations, they admire the care that families give to their children. So it is not all bleak. It is, in fact, you can say it is a story of success despite adversity and under adversity. And it is remarkable. It really is remarkable. Having said all this, the problems that I have alluded to are real problems, and it is the duty of society and duty of education in general and higher education to try and solve them, ameliorate them, and cope with them. We are always hampered by the dearth of resources and the unreliability of resources. Unreliability of resources is a real problem because it makes planning so much more difficult.
Okay, let's just pause for a moment because I do want to just bring in for our viewers as well a few more numbers and statistics for us to chew over here. More than half of all children who are out of school anywhere in the world are living in these war zones. That is a number of 39 million children out of a total of 72 million. So you see the acute effect that war zones have on education. Have a look at some of these numbers. 1 in 3 children in those war zones doesn't go to school. That is compared with 1 in 11 in other low-income countries. We look at Somalia as one of the worst examples. 81%, would you believe, of school-aged children there have no access to education. 4/5 of the children just can't get anywhere near school. And one final number, and this is going to lead on into my next question. The issue of funding. Children in war zones make up 60% of the annual funding requirements for education, yet only 1/10 of what they need was committed in 2008. And of course, we know what happens when money is committed. A lot of the time, it doesn't actually reach the people who need it. Tove, this is the issue of funding here. I think people have got good intentions, as we discussed earlier, but education in a war zone is not seen as an acute problem because you've got to worry about humanitarian assistance, you've got to worry about stopping the conflict, medical things, food, all these things. Education, does it even get a look in when it comes to that funding?
I mean, the recent year, I would say 2 years maybe, there is much more recognition of giving education in conflict and in emergency situations. So there is some positive development there. But just to point to the figures that you're raising, I mean, in 2015, when we are supposed to meet Millennium Development Goals,
Of course, yeah.
the portion of children that are going to be out of school are likely to be found in conflict-affected areas or are the hardest to reach children. So if you don't concentrate on this group of children now, they will be left behind in 2015. And they will, in a way, be doubly injustice because, first of all, they live in conflict, which is a trauma in itself. And if, in addition, you are denied your right to education, you are sort of doubly punished. So it's a really...
So how do we change that? Not that we can solve the world's education problems in a 22-minute program.
But in fact, has shed some light on it, and it's put it more firmly on the global agenda. And we just have to keep working for more financing, as you say, to education in conflict-affected areas. I think there are many arguments for education that doesn't really come to the forefront. We keep saying it's a right, yes, and it's a good way of creating normalcy for children. It gives hope and esteem and all of that. But what we have seen, for instance, in Nepal is that when young boys and girls, but particularly boys, have the possibility of going to school, they are not recruited into armed forces or armed rebel groups. So it's sort of a preventive measure as well. And the other point I'd like to make is that when education is not provided, that might be the cause of conflict. Because young people want to voice their opinion and raise this injustice. If they have no chance to go to school, it's unfair, and that might be the root of conflict.
Let me put that to Mushtaq. It's a brilliant thought, isn't it?
Yeah, it
that
is.
education, if you educate the people in the first place.
Absolutely. I want to add on one more aspect towards, you see, yes, money will always be needed to sort of fund the education in war zones. However, I feel that the people who are living in the war zones have to also participate, in the time and giving their time or giving their energies towards certain. You see, they can't just be sitting, complacently and waiting for money to pour it. I'm sure Dr. Hindi will tell us, because of the Palestinian on the lower level, on the primary and secondary level, there are a lot of initiatives which are coming about, not necessarily which have been funded through foreign sources, and from within the community, success stories arise out, and obviously then those things can be supported by money, because always remember one thing. I take it from my model, from the Citizen Foundation model, that when there is a ground reality of a success of a particular system, people will look at it very seriously and want to fund it seriously. So if there is nothing on the ground, and nobody wants to give money for abstract causes or abstract thoughts. So point is that it's like put your money where your mouth is, sort of. It's a self-help basis. Bring about something, whether it's a calamity, disaster, or a war situation, show it to the international community. Look here, this is a successful model. We have, and it's an indigenous model, and it's working. Once that is working, then you expect that people will come and help you out. Even if money is scarce or money is hard to find, people will fund even war situations like that.
We are starting to run down the clock. I'm going to leave the final word to you, Khalil, just briefly, if you wouldn't mind. We're at a conference here in a country where money is no objective, where you can assemble top minds to come and talk like this. What can a summit like this achieve? What should it be able to achieve?
Well, the summit is first and foremost a forum for exchange of ideas. And exchanging ideas, when ideas take hold of people's imagination, become material forces. And this is the importance of a summit like this. People exchange ideas, these ideas are developed, and then hopefully they will impact reality, they will lead to development and progress. This is the great thing about gatherings like this one. And hopefully also the networking that happens within summits like this will help fundraising efforts for poorer countries, for poorer regions, for regions of less development, regions where local conflicts are there.
This has been a fantastic conversation, it really has, and I thank you all for joining us. Tova Vang from Save the Children, Khalil Hindi from Birzeit University, and Mushtaq Chapra from the Citizens Foundation in Pakistan. Thank you all, really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And thank you, of course, our viewers, as ever, for joining us for this special edition of Inside Story Action. If you've got a comment on the show or a suggestion for a future show, please send it to us. Hop on the email, insidestory@aljazeera.net is our email address. From the whole team, though, here at the WISE Summit in Doha, it's goodbye for now.